Hello, everybody. Might as well get started. My name is Brian Gillis. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Art and the program manager for Critical Conversations, an engine for contemporary art and art inquiry that's rooted in exchange between artists, arts writers, and cultural producers. It's my pleasure to welcome Jordan Amirkhani to talk to us today about her work and thinking. But first, I'd like to take a moment to recognize that the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilahi, the traditional homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their land by the United States government and forcibly removed to the coast reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions to their communities at the U of O and across the lands we now refer to as Oregon and the United States and to the world. In acknowledging the original people of the land we occupy, we extend our respect to the indigenous people of Oregon and all other displaced indigenous people who call Oregon home. While I fully believe in the practice of acknowledging the land we occupy as agents of this institution, I'm increasingly uncomfortable with the ways that this practice may allow institutions and individuals to less urgently address issues caused by colonialism that are still present in the lived experience of individuals and communities. With this land acknowledgement, I'd also like to publicly acknowledge the toxic potentials that both individual and institutional virtue signaling may have on a range of people and groups. And I'd like to call attention to the responsibility those of us who benefit from the relationship to the University of Oregon and established structures of power have to continue to work beyond statements, to do the work to support people on their terms. Additionally, by acknowledging the land we occupy, I'd also like to propose a form of collective gratitude for the ability to be here today. On this land, in the relative safety of this building, which benefits from a great deal of resources and freedoms that have allowed all of us the privilege to assemble under the auspices of free intellectual exchange and inquiry. Before introducing Jordan, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Critical Conversations program, which is a collaboration between the University of Oregon and the Ford Family Foundation, who sponsored this talk. The Ford Family Foundation's Visual Arts program honors the foundation's late co-founder, Hallie Ford, and her lifelong interest in the arts by helping Oregon's most promising visual artists actively pursue their work. One element of the program is Critical Conversations, a collaboration between us and the foundation that currently works in partnership with the Pacific Northwest College of Art at Willamette University and Reed College's Cooley Gallery. Organizing partners facilitate a year-round calendar of studio visits for Oregon artists by 3 prominent visiting curators or critics. We host related public lectures like this one and other forms of engagement with these visitors and oversee a series of convenings that engage community participants around currents in society and the field. In addition to events like today's, engagement is made accessible to broader audiences through a variety of platforms, including Critical Conversations annual publication, for which we gather content from a range of activities and commission writing around a theme. And Jordan is a contributor for our upcoming issue, which should release in January. This program is such a gift to artists and cultural producers in the state of Oregon, and I'd like to acknowledge the people who represent our partner institutions and who together have brought the state of Oregon such an exceptional, visionary set of curators, critics over the years. Thank you to Stephanie Snyder, the director and curator of the Cooley Gallery at Reed College, Shauna Lipton, associate professor and chair of the MA program in critical studies at PNCA, Oregon artist Ralph Puget for all of their efforts and dedication to this program as advisory board members and editorial board members. Also, a deep thank you to Yael Amir and Steph Littlebird for their vision and leadership as commissioning editors for the Critical Writing Initiative, for which our publication will soon be released. And also thank you to Megan Atiyah, the senior advisor for the Ford Family Foundation's Visual Arts Program, for her boundless partnership, support for all things related to critical conversations. I'd also like to give a big thanks to Laura Butler Hughes, Critical Conversations Program Coordinator, for all of her essential help with more things than we have time to list here. And additionally, it's important to acknowledge the contributions made by my colleagues in the Department of Art, Center for Art Research Program Manager Wendy Heldman, and to CFAR's Director Tanaz Farsi for your continued dedication and support. Now, after acknowledging where we are and how we got here, let's talk about Jordan a little bit. It's with deep gratitude that I welcome Jordan as a speaker today, and this week as an itinerant creative who will move throughout the state of Oregon, visiting artist studios and art spaces, and meeting with creatives in more informal settings. Over the last year, my reverence for Jordan has only grown. Jordan Amirkhani is curator and head of research and project development at Rivers Institute for Contemporary Art and Thought, a nonprofit organization based in New Orleans, Louisiana, committed to research and publishing, exhibitions and convenings on art of the global diaspora. Prior to taking these roles, Amirkhani held academic positions at American University in Washington, D.C., and the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga. Jordan's recent curatorial projects includes Tina Girouard Sign-In at Art and Practice in Los Angeles and at St. Cloud Gallery in New Orleans, Troy Montez Michi Rock of I at the California African American Museum in Los Angeles and the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, and Yoto Barada, Ways to Baffle the Wind at Mass MoCA. Jordan's writing has been featured in many national and international publications, including the Paris Daily Review, or the Paris Review Daily, Art Forum, Art in America, Baltimore Arts, Boston Art Review, Xterra, Musée, and Bernaway. Her emphasis on contextualizing contemporary art and artists working in the American South garnered her prestigious Creative Capital and Andy Warhol Foundation short-form writing grants, and 3 nominations for the Rabkin Prize in Arts Journalism in 2017, 18, and 19. By all accounts, and from personal experience, I could say that Jordan's curiosity, intellectual depth, and creativity, and deep humanity is truly special and regularly makes meaningful impacts on the world. I very much look forward to your talk. Please help me welcome Jordan.
Can you guys hear me okay? Great. Hi. I will start in a moment, but thank you so much for that kind introduction, Brian. I feel the same way about you, and to everyone that I have met here so far. Everyone has been so kind and so generous and welcoming. I've been to Oregon before, but never to Eugene, so I'm learning a lot about the community here and how you guys live and work and play and laugh and enjoy the campus community that you've built here. And I feel really honored to be here, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Thank you so much to the Ford Family Foundation for creating this incredible program. I feel like it is such a model for other places outside of centers of capital to pool resources and do things together, share networks, and be truly collaborative with other institutions. I wish there were more of that, and you guys are really, really doing it here, which I think is really special. This is a really special program. And to all of the students and artists and staff and faculty that I've met already, thank you for welcoming me. I'm a Southerner, so hospitality means a lot to me. I'm Iranian, so hospitality means a lot to me. And you guys have really set the bar, so I appreciate that. I also just feel like this is a very weird time. I feel like talking about art sometimes doesn't feel like very urgent. There are real urgent emergencies out there right now, but I also know that just being in a room together like this, thinking about something together, feels really political and important, and I'm grateful to do it with you all today. So thanks for being here in a weird time. I'm going to talk about Tina Girouard today, but I feel like I need to do a little bit of setup about maybe who I am, how I think about my work, and also think a little bit about how my work sort of has become shaped and established in this organization that I co-founded with my colleague Andrea Anderson in 2020. I've had, as some of you may know, a very winding path in the art world. I was a professional and trained dancer at the start of my career. I shifted to art history a little bit later than I thought than most of my art historian colleagues. And I've spent time in a variety of institutions, in universities, in nonprofits, working as a academic in art schools and art studio and art history departments. I've worked as a critic and writer and freelance curator as well. And all of those things seemed to, when I was beginning my career, feel very separate and scattered and fragmented. And now I realize that all of those things sort of came together to do what I do now. And for the students in the room who are thinking about what they do after this, just know that all of it will matter at some point, no matter what you do. It ends up paying off and rewarding you for all the opportunities and chances that you give yourself. So, as Brian mentioned, I am currently curator and head of research and development at Rivers Institute for Contemporary Art and Thought, which is based in New Orleans. I was born in Louisiana. For a long time, I thought that I was going to have to leave Louisiana to do the kind of work that I felt I needed to do, whether that was to become a dancer, or whether that was to become someone invested in contemporary art and contemporary praxis. And Rivers is actually a space that I felt like I dreamed of working in my whole life, but never really got the chance to do it in the place where I was from. And so to build something in a place that I call home, in a place that I believe is one of the richest and one of the richest sort of intellectual, historical, cultural spaces in the contiguous United States, and to give that back to various publics feels very special, and I'm thrilled to talk with you about that today. I will also just say that, as I was writing this talk, I thought it would be kind of one thing, and as I wrote it and spent time, it sort of turned into something kind of personal about what it means to do this work now, what it means to be a member of the so-called art world, and what it means to sort of do things in a collaborative spirit of partnership and generosity. So if anything, I just appreciate the gift of being able to pull all these things together and talk about it with you today. It's why I wanted to sort of spend some time talking about archives. In my family, my parents crossed a lot of borders and oceans to get to this place, and archiving was a very personal part of my family's kind of a daily life and habits and rituals. Scrapbooks were filled with photos. Things were collected from performances I was in. Every sort of test that I got an A on was photocopied and put into a folder and mailed to my family in Iran. which we can talk about another time, how traumatic that was. But I've always been a sort of collector. My family are collecting people, saving things, keeping things, holding on to memories, both material and object-based. And so I have always been someone who has sort of thought about times in my life or memories or histories that live inside my family and my body through objects. And one of the things that attracted me very much to becoming an art historian in the first place was that notion of collections and archives being spaces that tell stories about things that I was unfamiliar with or things that I felt very close to. Archives are really special places. And when I was in grad school, this is of course the time where everybody is reading Archive Fever and The Archival Impulse by Hal Foster, which is a great text. If you haven't read it, you should read it soon. This notion that contemporary art is sort of coming to terms with the archival space, not just as an institution, but as a place of holding on to, grabbing onto, attaching memories and connecting them to histories, both local, national, international, cultural, et cetera, was very exciting to me. And yet, we also know that archives are not spaces of total fullness and totality either. They are institutional spaces as well, with gaps, with absences, with things that are redlined or missing. And you know, a part of sort of my recognition of my own family's archives is to also recognize that those archives also have gaps and absences too. What my parents were collecting, the memories that they were holding on to, doesn't sort of tell the full picture of my family story. Archives are the same way. They sort of like gather the things that are remaining or remainders of a particular history, culture, community, or time, but they are never the full story. And so I mention this in relationship to Rivers Institute, which is where I work now, because my executive director and I both came from academic backgrounds, were art historians by training, but realized that contemporary artists were not just interested in exploring or spending time with archives, but that there is this kind of wave in contemporary art practice right now, which I feel like we are in the midst of artists looking to institutional spaces, archives in particular, to draw on them for more than just research, but to see them as spaces of making and unmaking all the time, that they are creative, fluid, organic spaces that hold information as much as sort of scatter and shape and construct information as well. And so a huge part of Rivers' work is to bring artists into deep contact with archives as a way of staging discovery, staging exploration, whether that is to build a new body of work, whether that is to do, to sort of finish a project or a practice that maybe at this moment in their career they're unable to sort of take on or need time or some long form space to sort of think and move through some new information or material. But to specifically also think about the archive as spaces where artists can be not just researchers. I think when researchers and people who are engaging in scholarship enter the archive, they do so with particular habits, ideas, draw from the archive, look at the archive, spend time with the archive in a particular way, one that is sort of there to take, I would say, information from the archive and deliver it into new scholarship or formations. Artists, I think, see archives much differently, again, as these places and spaces of unmaking, of story, of narrative, of contextualizations, and also of, you know, artists pick up on things in archives that maybe a researcher might miss, like maybe the image-based works are speaking to them more than a text or a document. Or maybe they have questions about you know, how the archive looks, what kind of space or structure, or how the architecture functions to guide or move a researcher into the space, et cetera. So archives are incredibly important to Rivers. We take them very seriously. We see them as spaces that are for artists just as much as traditional researchers. And we began to sort of think about archives that might also inhabit a spirit of archives particular to New Orleans. And so one of the things that the archives also make present for Rivers is a situation of, well, actually, I'm going to go back this way. Sorry, my computer is stuck. There we go. So archives are incredibly important to Rivers, as I mentioned. But one of the things that I think we sort of initiated very quickly when we founded in 2020 was this notion of what archives we might work with and what archives we might spend time with and engage artists within. And so, sorry, there's a... My computer is like buzzing. Apologies. Okay. Stop. There we go. Rivers is also an organization, a small but mighty one of 4 people, that is built in collaboration and partnership. New Orleans is, like I said, a very historically rich space, culturally, politically, et cetera. But it's a space that's really a music town. And I feel like, you know, if anybody has been to New Orleans before, they recognize that it is one of the most important landmarks for American and global music, perhaps in this country and definitely in the world. But the contemporary art institutions that exist there often function as multiple places. They're event spaces as well, or they are attached to universities that feel less public and more closed off. But in 2020, we recognized that the Amistad Research Center, which is on the campus of Tulane University, but not owned or operated by Tulane, was one of the largest African-American diasporic archives in the country next to the Schomburg Center. It contains over 8 million documents. It has an art collection of 800 fine art objects. And yet, if you asked an average researcher, artist, or lay person in New Orleans what the Amistad Research Center was, nobody could really tell you. In 2020, the executive director of Amistad approached Andrea and I at Rivers and and was eager to initiate a residency program at Amistad. And one of the things that we immediately found was not only a sort of simpatico relationship between our work and the work of Amistad, but a desire to get creatives and artists in particular inside of the archives to create and build new work. Since that formative partnership in 2020, we have extended our reaches into all kinds of collaborations and partnerships in order to support the exhibitions, the print publications, the public programming, and our various other activities as an organization. We recognize that we cannot do all of our work alone, that to share and collaborate and pool resources is the way in which a lot of our projects get done. And that to do so not only enriches the bodies of work and projects that we work on with artists, but also allows these projects to circulate and move into new communities and publics, not just in New Orleans, but across the United States and in some cases across the world. These are just a few of our partnerships that are current as of now, and there will be more to come as Rivers develops. This is my colleague Jade Flint in the reading room at the Amistad Research Center. She's a joint appointment between Rivers and Amistad who helps artists when they are in the archive research, engage materials, and offers archival and librarian support to them while they're in place with us. So we're very grateful to her for that role. In the beginning of Rivers' work, as I mentioned, we started in 2020, and as I know all of you will recall, 2020 was a very challenging and difficult year. We were in lockdown for most of it, and yet, as I think a lot of us in the art world found, projects still had to go on, even though we could not leave our homes, which was both terrifying and also challenging in a variety of ways. When lockdown happened, Rivers' first sort of premier project was a mid-career retrospective of the artist Sanford Biggers, who is based in California. The retrospective was research and planning and production began for that in 2019. And it was a project that basically sort of centered his sort of growing and ongoing body of work of reformatting and reconstructing vintage and antique and found quilts. Sanford has for a long time thought of the quilt as a kind of code or index of migration and movement and histories of African diasporic communities in the United States. There's a lot of very interesting research about the quilt as being a sort of memory map or terrain where the patterns and the decorations sort of infill a kind of history, a sort of embedded history of enslaved communities across the United States, talking and speaking to one another through pattern and form. Sanford has been working on this body of work, I believe, since 2012. And the exhibition was the first presentation of all 126 of those quilts together, one of which I'm showing you here on the left. But it was also accompanied by a project by the artist Candace Williams, who runs and founds Cassandra Project, which began as a digital blog transposed into an Instagram account full of archival images of Black culture from the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, recontextualizing archival information and specifically archival photography from public archives all across the United States. And so Rivers committed to supporting Candace's research at Amistad Research Center to sort of mine Amistad's archive for all kinds of sort of interruptive, glitchy images that tell a story of New Orleans theater and New Orleans Black performance during the Civil Rights era in the 60s and 70s. And so to pair Sanford's project of quilts with Candace's sort of own kind of mining of the archive of archival photography from Amistad's collection really sort of began Rivers on this sort of decision to sort of think about how we might bring Amistad's collection into almost all of the projects and presentations that we do. And that investment continues today. And so on the right is Candace Williams' sort of archival intervention into Amistad's collection. You can see she's blown up some of the archival posters and pamphlets from the New Orleans Black Theater, which to this day is one of the earliest Black-founded theater organizations in Louisiana. They organized in the late 50s and were run by a variety of Black activists, some of whom are still alive in New Orleans today and are sort of elders of their respective communities. And so, yeah, this is how our sort of enriched engagement with archives began. Ito Barada's presentation, Ways to Baffle the Wind, which opened at Mass MoCA in 2021, is a different way into the archive of Amistad's collection. Ito is a Moroccan-French artist, and our exhibition with her, Ways to Baffle the Wind, was a kind of riff on the kind of strange connection between Morocco and New Orleans as sites of kind of climate fantasy. Morocco in the early part of the 20th century was a sort of had a number of sort of centers of climate, early climate construction think tanks, sponsored by the French government, sponsored by the Moroccan government. One of them was called the Baffler Institute, where these sort of strange kind of science fiction projections about how to control desert winds to keep them from hitting tourists at fancy hotels were sort of invented. Of course, none of these projects ever really saw the light of day, but the idea that the state, the French state, was sort of supporting research in trying to control climate as early as the 19-teens was very interesting to Ito and to us. New Orleans is also a place of a lot of climate fantasies. It is at the front lines of climate disaster and change. And there are various kinds of institutes and organizations, some sponsored by state and local governments, some sponsored by private funding, to think about how to not only extract more resources from the ground, but to also invent or fantasize about how to control the more negative aspects of climate disaster, be that toxic pollutants in the air. There was an organization in New Orleans that no longer exists, but was called the Fiedler Institute, which drew up all of these sort of plans about shooting sand into the sky as a way of clearing toxic smoke and fumes out of New Orleans and bayou-centered communities. And of course, when you shoot sand into the sky, you end up killing everything underneath it. So this exhibition was Ito Barada's creation of her own sort of climate fantasy solutions. You can see an absurdist in nature. You can see on the right-hand side the title from the exhibition, Ways to Baffle the Wind. This is her wind baffling machine. It's a simple fan unplugged on the ground, and the wind from the galleries in the room just sort of shook the cotton balls as a way of pointing to the wind and air circulation patterns in the room itself. But the photograph I'm showing you in the middle is a film of Ito's called Tree Identification for Beginners. As I mentioned, Ito is a Moroccan French national. Her mother, as a young woman, was invited from Morocco on a state-sponsored trip to the United States in the 1960s, which the papers of those trips and travels funded by the State Department are located in the Amistad Research Center collection. And when Ito saw those papers, while in residency with us, she immediately recognized them because her mother had talked about going on one of those sort of state-sponsored trips to the US in the 60s. I won't tell you the story here, but there are audio tapes that she found of her mother talking on the to State Department officials about her experience on the trip. And there are a number of sort of like long extended passages of Ito's mother saying, I came to the United States to meet the Black Panthers and nobody would take me to them, and I'm very upset and I hate this trip and I never want to come to the US again. It's like, 1969, 1970, that's a pretty strong thing to say to State Department officials at that time. This gives you a sense of what Ito's mother is like, I would say. But for Ito to find her own mother's voice in the archive, in an archive that exists in New Orleans, thousands of miles away from where she was born and where she lived, I think was not only incredibly emotional for us, all of us really, but also a recognition that diasporic histories in that collection are much vaster and much wider than any of even the librarians and archivists who worked there for decades ever imagined. And again, I think it's that artist impulse of finding and searching and excavating in their own way, as opposed to something specific maybe, that reinforced this for us. I'll move quickly through this. I will also just say that in a final sort of example of a project, a Rivers project in the archives before I talk about Tina's work, is our sort of 3-year long-form research collaboration with the UK-based artist Helen Kamek. Helen Kamek came to visit Amistad's collection, I believe in January of 2023. She was supposed to stay for 1 week, and she ended up staying for 2 months. The first week that she was there, she encountered the papers of Elizabeth Catlett, which are the artist, whose papers are held in Amistad's collection, and began reading all of these letters Elizabeth Catlett was writing to friends and family about a commission that she received to do a sculpture of the musician Louis Armstrong for Congo Square in New Orleans. Elizabeth Catlett, for a period of time before she emigrated to Mexico in the 70s, was the chair of the art department at Dillard University, which is a historically Black university in New Orleans. There's a very famous story of her taking her undergraduate art students to the New Orleans Museum of Art in 1959 and being turned away, even though, because the New Orleans Museum of Art was still segregated at that time. It had a huge impact on her. It sort of catalyzed her to move to Mexico and to start the work of Black liberation from abroad as opposed to inside the United States. And so her papers tell this story of not just the sort of frustrating and failure of this public commission of the Louis Armstrong statue, which the city of New Orleans commissioned from her and then revoked. But a story of what it meant, I think, to engage in resistance from afar, and to feel sort of like the local effects and machinations of power through an artistic practice first and a political space second. Helen was very drawn to these papers and began working on a print publication with us almost as soon as she arrived, a kind of meditation on what it means to make work on commission, what it means to make work as a Black queer woman in New Orleans, and I would say a Black queer British woman in New Orleans. One of the things that I think Helen responded to immediately upon arrival in New Orleans is that New Orleans was the first time that she could really relax in her own body in public space. New Orleans is a predominantly Black city. I think in London, where she lives, she feels her identity in a very powerful and visible and intense way all the time. And so the reason, as I mentioned, she was only going to be with us for 1 week. She ended up staying 2 months because she said she felt so comfortable and at home. And that, that's not just the New Orleans French Quarter talking. I think that is many more things on top of it. We published a book called I Will Keep My Soul, which is the title, not just of the book, but of the accompanying film, which we commissioned from her, much of that footage takes place in the Amistad Research Center's stacks and archives. It's a meditation on her time in New Orleans. It's a meditation on her engagement with Elizabeth Catlett's papers. And it's also a meditation on what it means to find belonging in archival spaces as much as public spaces. And that work, this film continues to sort of migrate and move on its own, and taking new shapes and forms across exhibition, print publication, and elsewhere. So as a kind of journey through some of River's early projects, it brings me to the work that I really want to talk about the most today, which is River's sort of 3-year commitment to the rehousing and organization and presentation, both in exhibition and publication form, of the estate and archive of Tina Girouard. Has anyone heard of Tina Girouard before today? I would be interested. No one? Okay, great. Tina Girouard was born in 1946 in Cecilia, Louisiana. She died in 2020, just before the pandemic began. And Tina is a really special artist for me, namely because I think as someone invested and engaged with a huge constellation of post-war American avant-garde histories, such as Anarchitecture, such as the pattern and decoration movement, such as the post-minimalist artists, early video art, early feminist performance art. She's involved, and not just involved, but an active participant and co-founder of all of these movements and cohorts, but no one knows her name. You probably know who Laurie Anderson is. You probably know who Gordon Matta Clark is. You probably know maybe who Philip Glass is. Tina Girouard was as important and as vital in those cohorts of artists, and yet she's not a household name, and there are very, very many reasons for that. Tina, as I said, was born in Cecilia, Louisiana in 1946. Her family is Acadian, so she comes, her great-grandmother came from Nova Scotia to Louisiana, which is a very sort of heavy and deep migration route from Nova Scotia to the southern tip of Louisiana. It's why Cajun country exists. It's why a very extended and gorgeous version of the French language is spoken in parts of Louisiana. And it's also a very special kind of landscape. It's bayou, it's swamp, it's farmland. And it's a place that I think Tina's practice very much carries with her throughout her career. This is some of my favorite archival photos of her walking through a field which is just directly east of her childhood home, and a plot of land where she built a house, and the plot of land where she died as well. So it's a very special photograph, or set of photographs. Tina received her BFA from the University of Southeastern Louisiana in 1968. It was about at that time that she met her boyfriend and then future husband, Richard Dickey Landry, who is a very important saxophonist of a particular sort of New Orleans Cajun improvisational jazz cohort. He was also one of the first founding members of the Philip Glass Ensemble, and Philip Glass has said that Dickey Landry is responsible for teaching him everything there is to know about improvisation and musical structure and form. So in 1968, Tina and Dickey get married, and they pack their car up with all of their stuff, and they move to New York City, where they stay until 1978. Their first stop is to go to Robert Rauschenberg's. He was the only person that they knew in New York at the time. Robert Rauschenberg is also a famous Louisianan who makes it to New York as well. Tina soon moves into an apartment in 10 Chatham Square, and her neighbors are not just Robert Rauschenberg, but Gordon Matta Clark, who she becomes fast friends with, and spends the next 5 years in deep intellectual and artistic engagement with in the group known as Anarchitecture. It's here that she begins working and beginning her own artistic practice separate from a group, a school, a movement. She begins working in large-scale installation and is an active participant in the cohort known as 112 Greene Street, which is one of the first sort of alternative art spaces and communal, non-hierarchical anti-art institutions founded in Soho in the early 1970s in New York. It became a kind of think tank and living space and art-making sort of space for a certain kind of downtown scene, of which Joan Jonas was a part of, Laurie Anderson, as I mentioned earlier, Richard Nonis, and many others. And it's here where Tina begins to sort of engage with her own sort of like set of ethics and values as an artist. It's turning into installation, but it's also becoming video. At some point in the mid to late 1970s, her work turns to performance. And I mention all of these things kind of simultaneously, just to give you a sense of how wide the scope and breadth of her practice was. I think it's important to remember that now we are very comfortable with artists working in different media and genres all the time, but Tina's generation was still very much of that art historical model that you picked a form or a genre and stuck with it. And many of her cohort did. People like Richard Serra, sort of stayed in a kind of post-minimalist tradition and carried on with it and found their way. But the amount of and the breadth of experimentation and transformation and experimentation in Tina's practice is really very novel and very acute, and is perhaps why art history hasn't been able to grab onto her so well, because she is sort of changing and evolving and moving into different genres and styles all the time. One of the things that I would say, just to go back to this photo, Rivers became involved with Tina Girouard in 2020 in a sort of chance meeting with Tina's niece named Amy Bonwell, who is the executor of Tina Girouard's estate. As I mentioned, Tina passed away in 2020, and one of the things that became very, very clear and very, very urgent for Tina's niece, who now found herself the steward and protector of Tina's entire body of work, is that there was a sort of urgency to get the archive and the works out of non-climate controlled places. If you've ever been to southern Louisiana, you know that air conditioning is necessary, and Tina's work had been in a non-climate controlled, non-air conditioned space for 30 years. That includes all of the installation work, all of the video work, the original tapes, all of the sort of ephemera and detritus from every project, practice, art grant from 1968 to 2020. So when Andrea, my colleague, and I heard that this archive and this body of work was needing sort of urgent care and rehabilitation and housing, we felt more than convinced that maybe perhaps our investment in archives could lend some support to this practice that felt so urgent and so art historically exciting, and sort of under-resourced as much as it was. Even people in Louisiana didn't know who Tina Girouard was. So we jumped on this project immediately and have, like I said, for the past 3 years been working in very, very close corners with Amy Bonwell and the estate to organize Tina's entire archival situation, I would call it. We have organized and collated and digitized almost 400,000 documents, which gives you a sense of how much Tina had and how much Tina was collecting over the course of her life. There were a lot of questions for us about how to approach that. We have never done this kind of large-scale project before. As I mentioned, Rivers is a 4-person organization, and we already do a whole lot between our residency and our public programs, our publications, and our other exhibitions. So we really had to sort of figure out and stretch ourselves in a variety of ways to follow through with this very important task, which requires a huge amount of commitment as well as sort of care and responsibility. But one of the things that I continue to think about is the way in which Tina was caring for her materials over her lifetime, and the way in which Rivers feels very committed to caring for artists and artworks in living time. That yes, this was a historical project. Yes, Rivers traditionally works with living cultural producers. to sort of work on a project, an exhibition, a print publication of an artist that has passed was something that we thought a lot about and tried to make sure that it was right for our mission. But it also simultaneously was so clear to us that Tina's practice felt so living. It's a practice that felt so engaged with so many themes and concerns and questions and material capacities that feel very much engaged with contemporary art in the United States. And it was also, as a feminist, one of the things that I think about a whole lot is the ways in which just the storage and care and financial support for women artists' practices, particularly legacy women artists who have of the 60s and 70s, have not been cared for and sustained and supported in the same way as their male counterparts. Again, we know Richard Serra's foundation is taking good care of his works. We know that Philip Glass's archive and legacy will be cared for way into the future through endowed foundations, et cetera. And Tina deserves the same. And so one of our sort of core projects has been to organize, house for, care for her archive, and to build a new conversation and community around her work, to insert her back into the significance of this particular time in art history, and to also sort of imagine a new sort of living public for these works that are so special. I'm showing you here an archival photograph on the left of works that are made out of what she called Solomon's Lot. When she left Louisiana with Dickie Landry in 1968, Richard's mother gave her a bundle of 8 silk patterned fabrics. She inherited, or she purchased these fabrics from a Palestinian dry goods salesman in the 1960s, who had been living in and around Cecilia, Louisiana since the early 1950s as an exile from Palestine after the Nakba. And he would very often sort of go from home to home in this very remote part of Louisiana where houses are separated sometimes by miles of bayou. Knock on the door, women of the house would usually answer, and he would be like, do you need anything for your house? Do you need a frying pan? Do you need a new set of china? Do you need clothing or fabrics? I will go procure that for you, and you can pay me when they arrive. He was kind of sort of like getting people what they need for their homes, driving to New Orleans or driving to Texas to go purchase these things and then return them to the ladies of the house. Richard's mother bought these sort of 8 silken patterned fabrics through Solomon Matlock's dry goods salesman services, and then gifted them to Tina as a kind of dowry. This being the late 60s in the American South, women were very often given bolts of fabric as a way to build a beautiful house, to start a home, to make clothing or curtains or bed linens or whatever you might need. Tina took them with her to New York as a gift, and these fabrics ended up being her kind of materials at the start of her practice. She never cut them. She only cared for them and sewed them and mended them and stretched them and used them across almost every genre of artistic activity from the early 70s until her death. You can see them here sort of suspended in the air, which was common for these early installations, very often sort of creating a kind of cupola or sort of slight architectural space inside of these sort of Soho loft spaces like 112 Greene Street, where she began her artistic career. You can see she's kind of like rolled them and bundled them on the left, which I love. She would then go on to use these fabrics in early video work. There's a really famous film of that she made in 1974 called Maintenance 3, where she's captures herself sort of washing and mending and sewing them. as a kind of maintenance of self-care or of maintenance practice of care for these materials. She then takes them into, hold on, let's go back. She then takes them all over the country as she begins to invest more in performance and moving image. Like I mentioned, she uses them in films across the 70s, but you can also see them stretched in a kind of mandala shape on the floor for a very important performance she did at the New Orleans Museum of Art in 1977 called Pinwheel. And it's this sort of not just care for these special materials, but this investment in domestic patterns and systems and materiality that I think is also an incredibly important part of Tina's practice. For those of you who don't know, Anarchitecture and Gordon Matta Clark's sort of, I would say, contribution to post-war American art is this notion that architecture is both a space and a non-space all the time. That architecture is not concrete, it's not stable. Architectural spaces, particularly spaces that are social or public in any kind of way, are porous because of the people who traverse inside and outside of them. Gordon Matta Clark's engagement with Anarchitecture and these sort of intellectual values turned into more kind of, I would say, a kind of structured, industrialized, mechanized shape. He was very often working with materials like metal and steel. He was doing sort of big kind of gestural actions to architectural spaces, whether that would be cutting through the side of a home or bulldozing an abandoned building, etc. And so we sort of associate Anarchitecture and through the lens of Gordon Matta Clark's relationship to that movement. Tina's Anarchitectural practices are much more subtle, but nonetheless powerful. She's very often thinking about the home as an architectural space just as much as Gordon is thinking about a public park or a sort of abandoned industrial warehouse. Homes for her were spaces of a lot of creativity, a lot of thinking, a lot of constructing and creating and sociality that I think allows her to impart a different kind of shape to Anarchitecture because of all of the ways in which I think gender is and class is informing her practice all the time. So I'm showing you here two archival photos of various exhibitions that Tina does across the early part of the 70s at 112 Greene Street. On the left is an exhibition called Screens, where she sort of buys kind of those, like big stacks of quilting squares that you could get in Chinatown for a very sort of inexpensive amount of money, and is sort of placing them into these kind of gorgeous quadrants, suspending them from the air. And what you can't see in that photo is actually that just outside to the right of these suspended textiles is where everyone at 112 Greene was sleeping and eating. It's the kitchen. So the ways in which people who are living and working at 112 Greene would have to sort of go in and out of these sort of suspended forms made of these sort of tossed away, sort of deeply sort of effeminately patterned materials, I think tells a very different kind of story about how she wanted people to move through 112 Greene, what she wanted them to think about, and how she wanted her work to kind of interrupt a predominantly male space, I would say. On the right-hand side is an archival photograph from a show she did in 1973 called Patterns. And, Gordon Matta Clark was also working with wallpaper, with fabric samples as well, but very often engaging in sort of destructive gestures with these materials, whether it was ripping them, burning them, documenting their destruction, or throwing them out of windowsills. Tina does a very sort of elegant and very sort of small gesture in her work with these same materials, pinning them to the wall, leaving them as exactly as they are, almost as if she is saying that these materials are already works of art, the way in which their color and pattern and the places in which these patterns and colors might go are sort of signals or stand-ins for the artistic creativity and beauty of domestic life, of domestic spaces. Again, this sort of softer, gentler side of Anarchitecture that I think gets less expressed, but is so prevalent and present in her practice. Just as the signs of house and home are significant to Tina, as she moves into the late 70s, also becomes extremely interested in signs and symbols from ancient cultures across the globe. I think, like many artists of her generation who protested against Vietnam, who were critical of the American government, who embraced a sort of hippie lifestyle and were curious and interested in Eastern Asian cultures and ways of being and living. Tina was not immune to that, particularly as an artist in Soho in New York in the late 70s. And she began sort of collecting an archive of books, which we were sort of astonished to see all of the sort of hundreds of books that she had collected over the years of signs and symbols, particularly from West African and Southeast Asian language systems and sign systems. In the beginning of this sort of research that she starts in the late 70s, she's sort of copying out and defining signs and symbols from other cultures and places, almost as kind of like a memorization project. It's really a sort of transcription, a one-to-one. What she's finding in books, she's writing in her notebooks in a direct way. As time moves on, though, she begins creating her own sort of signs and symbols with definitions that are very often tongue-in-cheek plays on language, and some of them are autobiographical, and some of them take up a sort of sign or symbol from her time in Anarchitecture and the community and friendships and cohorts and kind of secret language that cohort developed for their own artistic practices. She's finding a kind of, and creating a kind of personal language for herself, which plays out in a variety of ways as she enters the 1980s. One of the things that we were very excited to do in the exhibition, which I'll talk about in a moment, of Tina's work that Rivers has been working on over the past year, is to gather what she called the DNA glyphs. It's 120 individual squares written, transcribed in pencil, of this personal language that she has developed after many years of studying other languages. She's sort of building a kind of vocabulary for herself, and sort of exchanging those symbols and using those symbols in other projects and practices across the 1980s and 1990s, turning her sort of like, investment in the pattern, investment in the sign from the domestic into something perhaps more legible, or if not legible, more linguistic. The responsibility of caring for this archive has been a real honor, a real challenge, but also offered us the opportunity, as we were thinking about shaping an exhibition of Tina's work, as a kind of grounding point for how we might tell a story of Tina's life and practice to a public who did not know her, does not know her very well. I have worked in a number of museums and presenting organizations in my past lives, and one of the things that I sort of realized in working on this project is that archival material in museum exhibitions, let's call them, are very often presented as accessories to the material works on the wall or in the middle of the room. And the archival is sort of like set away in a vitrine for you to sort of like engage with tangentially or to the side of the real serious things going on in the center of the room or on the wall. And we very much wanted to sort of reverse that schematic, not because we care about archives more than we care about artworks, but that Tina's archive created a kind of third space in her practice that allowed us to sort of contextualize and see the material works that she was making in a completely new way that we would not have been able to do had we just presented the remainder of her practice without the archival material. Tina is documenting, as I said, everything. We digitized over 400,000 pieces of things, not because she was she was a hoarder, but because she was like actively sort of using the archive and an archival process to notate and mark and tell a story in her own way through ephemera. So the positioning of the archive in the exhibition for us as curators, I think, helped us really sort of see that this project about Tina was just as connected to the projects that we have been working on with living artists since the beginning of our tenure, that there is a real living history at work in Tina's practice, and that to foreground and to center that was to indeed engage in the sort of mission of Rivers, which is to sort of tell a story about the movements and migrations of a person, of a practice, of an artist through time as much as through geography. In 1978, Tina and Dickie leave New York for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is that the studio that Tina had been keeping at the World Trade Center caught fire, and she lost a lot of important work, particularly works on paper from the mid-70s that, I still dream about what that studio contains and what we're perhaps missing from this story that we worked very hard to tell. But another reason, I think, is that Tina was not very interested in the transition from alternative artist-run spaces to the commercialization of the art world and gallery system in New York. If you think about what is happening in the early 70s with 112 Greene Street, with the kitchen, with white columns, with all of these sort of artist-run spaces where the experimentation is centered and it's kind of casual do-it-yourself attitude. By 78 and 79, I think Mary Boone's gallery opens in 1978. I think Wall Street makes a huge spike in 1978 with financial bros attending gallery openings for the first time, and downtown New York is a little bit more expensive now that rich kids have the story of New York goes on at every generation, for sure. I think Tina and Dickie were not interested in that. There are some personal losses in Dickie's family that keeps them, that calls them home in 1977. The death of Dickie's son, Russ, in 1977 was very heartbreaking, and I think they decide to move home. What that has meant for Tina's life and career, I think, is very telling. Sort of after 1978, 79, she kind of drops out of a particular art world that she was associated with and belonged to, and spends almost the rest of her life in southern Louisiana. Upon arrival, she and Dickie find a general store in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, which is about 15 miles away from their hometown of Cecilia. Tina falls immediately in love with this general store, but it's of course not in the right place. So she, being herself and a very sort of do-it-yourself capable young woman who will try anything once, she decides to hire a crew to move the house from Breaux Bridge to Cecilia on this fantastic, fabulous truck. Across a bridge that is definitely not supposed to contain that much weight or load. And she documents the entire thing. She calls this project Moving House. It is one of the most special things that we found in the archive. Not even Tina's family members knew about this or the project until we discovered it in her archival papers. There's about 29 photographs in the entire series. And every time I look at it, it makes me chuckle, not only because this is the home that Tina sort of lived out the rest of her life and career in, but that Gordon Matta Clark could never do this. Like, this is like real Anarchitecture shit, I feel. Like, you know, moving a house on a truck and taking photos of it, incredible. Tina Girouard was also an administrator as much as she was an artist. I think she doesn't get enough credit for that. One of the most famous sort of early administrative projects that she supports is, of course, the restaurant Food, which she co-founds with the artists Carol Gooden and Gordon Matta Clark in 1971. Again, this is a project that Gordon gets a lot of credit for. In fact, all of the food archives are in the Gordon Matta Clark archive, and are very difficult to sort of access and engage with, which sort of allows him to take a more, I think, full credit for the administration and capacities of Food than maybe he deserves. Controversial, you know. But I'm showing you the food menu, one of the first food menus on the left-hand side. And for those of you who don't know, Food Restaurant was opened in 1971, and basically was the idea of Carol, Tina, and Gordon to open a restaurant in a place on a block in New York City where there weren't a lot of like cheap places to eat for all of the industrial workers and market workers who lived in the sort of close vicinity, but also, of course, all of these artists who had sort of patchy day jobs. You know, Dickie was like driving a taxi from like 8 p.m. to 3 o'clock in the morning. Tina was working in a school from 8 a.m. to 1. It's when you could live in New York for 50 cents. And folks needed a place to not just eat, but also hang out. And Gordon, Tina, and Carol saw an opening, or saw that a building was for sale. Carol fronted the money. Gordon provided all of the construction and build out of the restaurant, but Tina provided all of the food and cooked every meal at Food until it collapsed in 1973. And again, when I think about like the real sort of administration of a restaurant, it's not, of course, just the building and the financial backing of it. It's the person who makes the food. And so, you know, a lot of the menu is very absurd and very silly, but what we do know is that Tina was in the kitchen every single day making a lot of Acadian and Cajun specialties, whether that was red beans and rice, jambalaya, her famous alligator sausage gumbo. There was boudin that you could buy out of the back kitchen window that she made herself. Boudin is like a Cajun sausage. I'll leave it at that. You can look it up on the internet. It's not for me. Food was an incredibly important and significant part of Tina's practice in New York. She very often was the person not just hosting the party, but cooking the food in the kind of Anarchitecture meetings and social gatherings that created the downtown scene and eventually led to their apartment being a site of performance and activation for happenings and early performance and video art. So her administration, I would say, in a certain kind of way, begins with food. And again, was something that we didn't sort of fully recognize until we spent time in the archive. Tina is also one of the co-founders of the Festival de Louisiane, which takes place every year to this day in Lafayette. It is one of the largest Francophone festivals in the world. She was very responsible for pitching this idea to state and local governments in Louisiana in the mid-1980s, just after the oil bust in Louisiana completely collapsed the socioeconomic structure in Louisiana. Oil wells were drying up. You couldn't sell your property fast enough. The prices of gas dropped, and millions of dollars were sucked out of Louisiana almost overnight. What Louisiana ends up doing in the aftermath of the oil bust is turn Louisiana into a tourism center. This is why many of you know about New Orleans to this day, even if you've never been. We like to drink, we like to dance, we like to party. You can come here and you can do anything, you can be anyone. Everything is permissive, but it's that tourism sort of energy that I think is what sort of has circulated New Orleans to the world. Tourism becomes incredibly lucrative and an incredible economic opportunity for the state of Louisiana after they lose a certain kind of economy in the mid-'80s. Tina recognizes this immediately, and she says artists should be making money in this process. How do I give money to artists? How do artists and cultural practitioners get in on this economic strategy? And she creates the Festival de Louisiane to bring artists from the Francophone world to Louisiana to perform for 2 weeks, but also to create a kind of network of art preparators, art event specialists from her artistic community, give them sort of jobs in administrating this festival, and that sort of tradition continues on today. In the 1990s, Tina begins to spend a huge amount of her time in Haiti. Louisiana and Haiti have a long history with one another. Tina spoke Creole and fluently from beginning as from her childhood. There's a huge Haitian population that even today continues to live in and around Beaubridge and Cecilia. And by the 1990s, Tina is meeting a lot of people who are traveling to Haiti to spend time with Haitian beadwork ateliers. She meets Antoine Oliant, who at that time was probably the most well-known and well-respected beadwork atelier owner in Port-au-Prince. They become fast friends, and she begins to spend time sort of in these various beadwork ateliers and sequin ateliers across the island of Haiti, and begins to realize that there are a number of American and Western European and even Canadian dealers who are coming to Haiti to buy Haitian art and take it, of course, back to their galleries or to their countries and sell it for a huge profit without crediting or involving the artist in that economic transaction. One of the reasons that she comes up with to sort of intervene, I would say, but also create context for these artists and support for these artists, is to publish a book called Sequin Artists of Haiti, which is still to this day one of the most comprehensive guides of Haitian art in existence. She recognizes that because Haitian art is spiritual in nature, Haitian artists do not sign their works, and so therefore it allows a certain kind of anonymity to the objects when they get sold on the market to be exchanged, traded, and sold again and again for increasing profits without the name of the artist attached to it. So this book actually is a sort of distillation of the various atelier styles, the names and acknowledgments of all of the Haitian atelier owners and stylists and masters of the craft, a brief explanation and interviews with them as a way of creating art historical context around their studios and practices, so that the next time someone tries to come into an atelier and buy works, they now know that they are part of a certain kind of history. She also begins telling them that they need to sign their work on the back so that they can get and receive credit down the line through provenance. So again, she's thinking about artists' communities all the time, whether they're her own or whether they're from elsewhere. This sort of fine line between art and life, between the administration of her work and the giving back to her community of peers, this thin line between what is making and what is caring, what is being cared for and what is caring for materials, what is caring for your community, what is caring for artists in particular, I think is very telling. I'm just going to share with you too a few exhibition and installation images of the exhibition that opened first in New Orleans at the Ogden Museum of Southern Art in March of this year. We knew we wanted to open this exhibition in Louisiana first. Of course, Louisiana is the home to Tina Girouard, but it was also an opportunity for the community that nourished her. Many of her friends and peers from Louisiana and the region were able to attend this opening and be a part of it and see her work sort of in the galleries, presented in a polished way, which was very special to us. And also for this exhibition to open at a museum of specifically Southern art felt very important and exciting to us as well. One of the things that the first presentation did was present her work chronologically, and curatorially, you know, that was something that also felt very important to us, to tell a story from the earliest to the latest part of her work, particularly to an audience that may not be familiar with all parts of Girouard's practice. I think for a lot of people in New Orleans and Louisiana who knew who Tina was and knew her practice even, all of the sort of early 1970s New York decade was not a part of their knowledge or experience or context of her. So to infill that gap and show this first audience the fullness of her project, the full picture of her practice was really important. It was also very important for us to tell a story in a multi-genre kind of way, not just for the installation works to be presented, but lots of the film and performance work to be shown. A lot of course, the domestic work of wallpaper works and textile works were shown as well, but that the archive was also present to infill that story. When the exhibition opened in September of this year in New York, we felt excited to do something very different with the telling of this narrative. We only had 3 galleries at our disposal as opposed to 5 in New Orleans. So a lot of reimagining of this exhibition had to take place. We really felt like in New York we could tell a more constellation. The methodology was more of a constellation, I would say. Each gallery sort of presenting works from various genres, various decades, various material practices in the same room as a way to reinforce those connections of themes and motifs that appear in her work across time. It felt like a real treat not to have to do the same thing over again. And it also allowed us to sort of find new depth in the arrangement of her work, and tease out some of the kind of special knowledge that we had sort of been holding for all of these years of being enmeshed in her archive for so long. So that was a real treat as well. We also were able to think in these two this exhibition with 2 different spaces to think about how architecture could be brought in to interrupt or kind of create new modes of information in the exhibition as well. Architecture was, of course, such an important part of the way in which Tina and Gordon were thinking about their practices in the 70s, that to bring architecture back into the conversation felt really exciting. I'm showing you here a work on the right-hand side, or on the left-hand side. It's an untitled tin work that Andrea and I found rusting in the back of the house that Tina had been living in. It's made out of ceiling tins. She had been collecting ceiling tins from various sort of abandoned homes in and around the bayou since as early as 1972. She was also sort of scavenging and collecting ceiling tins from all these abandoned loft spaces in New York, taking them into her studio and sort of recombining them, cutting into them in these very sort of elegant, subtle ways. And the work on the left is evidence of that sort of wall-based practice. For a huge amount of the 70s, Tina is working in the middle of the room, creating large-scale installations in the air, on the ground. She's performing in 3-dimensional space. So to see her return to the wall in the late 70s and to do so with these sort of abandoned architectural materials felt so incredibly exciting. More exciting to realize that this work was never presented to the public. What you can't see in her lifetime, what you can't see from the photo is impressions of bubble wrap on the surface of the tin work, namely because when Andrea and I found it, it had been in a non-air conditioned, non-climate controlled space for so long with bubble wrap sort of disintegrating on top of it, leaving this strange sort of puckered patina to the surface of the work. We immediately were heartbroken about that because, I think there is a sense that these works are really in urgent need of conservation and care, and they haven't been for so long. And what does it mean to the sort of legacy of these works that are in our care now, and that we hope, will migrate and move to collections and institutions through the trajectory of this show. But then we are, of course, reminded that life happens to artworks, and that maybe those traces and indexical marks tell a story unto themselves about neglect, about what it means to live away from centers of financial strength at times in your careers when you need them the most, particularly artists who make big things at scale. And to also think about what this house has sort of done for Tina's practice. Yes, it's not in the best condition, but it's also been the thing that she has cared for and made across time and space, has nurtured not just her own self and that of her family, but these works as well, and that tells a story about that sort of thin line between art and life too. It felt very special. We also were able to do some interesting things with these bolts of fabrics that Tina sort of carried with her across genre and decades. These are 4 fabrics that appear and reappear all the time in the kind of Solomon Lots bundle, in performances and video works and installations, etc. And so for the Ogden presentation on the right-hand side, we were able to stretch them in the atrium and create a kind of cupola or balcony-like space in ways similar to how Tina was using them both outdoors and indoors, which felt very dramatic and very fun. The presentation in New York was a different sort of architectural space, and so we only decided to hang one, but it felt like such a sort of strong note to start the show, and the wall text with this incredibly beautiful Laura Ashley adjacent 1990s feeling patterned fabric that to me feels so Tina. And just as a way of sort of sharing about how this project will go on, the show in New York is up until January 12th. So if you're in New York across the next few weeks, please visit. There will be a 3rd presentation in 2025, but I can't announce it yet. Although if you give me some wine this evening, I may tell you. It's very exciting. We at Rivers are, of course, very deeply committed to print publications. Galleries, exhibitions are wonderful, but books get into more people's hands and travel and circulate the world in ways that, as someone who likes to write, makes me feel really good. So we are working on a book, on not a exhibition catalog. It won't have installation images in it or anything, but a true artist book that really centers the archive. So that will appear in spring of 2025. We're working with Portland, Oregon's own Scott Ponick, who is one of the most wonderful publication designers on planet Earth. We're very lucky, and are very excited to sort of share the bounty of this archive with a new generation of people. And perhaps that, Tina's name gets mentioned and circulated a little bit more as more people become familiar with her work. So I'm going to end there. I've talked your ear off.
I think we have time for a couple questions if folks have any.
Hi.
Hey.
I've worked
Yeah.
The Oregon Historical Society.
Yes.
And the Wayne County History Museum. Don't leave local history to old people.
Yes.
Those are resources you should use.
Oh my gosh, yes. Go to your local archives. They're open, they're available to you. There is bounty in there. Go nuts. Thank you.
That's all I want.
No, thank you for that. That's the goal.
I have a question.
Oh yeah.
Throughout this talk, I just kept thinking about you, and what Rivers does is like putting yourself between things that are seen and things that are unseen.
Yeah.
Almost akin to a diviner or somebody who like occupies multiple realities or worlds at the same time. And I've long been interested in archives, and I think I came to them like right at the dawn of digitization.
Yeah.
And I go back and forth related to a lot of different issues, you know, material, like how archival material is, whether electronic is more archival, whether paper is more archival. And throughout this talk, seeing, did you see it was 400,000 pieces? And that was like a 30-year period.
Yeah.
Period.
I think the earliest document we have is from '67 and up till 2020 to her death. So
like
50-ish years, yeah.
400,000, one person, 50 years pre-internet.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you could talk about, you're in this position now where you're between worlds in a way. And if you could talk about the challenges and opportunities related to the archive in a moment where there is so much information right now.
Yeah.
And it's hard to, there's information overload. There's also like information ambiguity, and there's more and more happening, and it's less and less physical.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the opportunities and challenges you see?
For sure. I mean, it's a really big question. One of the things that this work has reminded me is of what it means to not just go and see touch real things, look at real objects with your body and eyes in a room, and to see how different that feels and how different you engage with it than when you're flipping through a digital catalog. Digital catalogs are incredible, but that's a first step. That's like an invitation to go, in my opinion, not like the end-all be-all of your archival work. Because what happens in an archive is you have to walk through a door, and you have to exchange your pen for a pencil. And there's all these people who work at the archive who know everything about it and have spent like their careers loving and caring for this thing and are there to help you. And so when you have a question, a human being is going to say, oh, I know what you should look at. There's a collection of XYZ over here. The digital archive is stuck to your keyword. And keywords, as we know, are highly politicized, highly hierarchical, highly like not equitable frameworks. They are things that are like shaped by all kinds of assumptions, predominantly white ones. What a keyword is for one person is going to not show up in a lexicon or a culture in another, and how things get sort of settled into these and classified under these various keywords is very, very politicized. So, to speak to like what it means to do this work now in this time of disinformation and false flags and fake news every time I go into the archive and I speak to an archivist and a librarian who's like devoted to like bringing people into that space and teaching them how to access it as well as touch it and engage with it and use it, is that, again, like a database is not a person. Misinformation happens because like it happens on a screen out here. It's easy to do it when you're just filtering it through things without bodies and saying and doing things without having to look another person in the eye or touch another person or see them cry or see them laugh or whatever. Like going into the archive, going into the library, spending time with a person who cares about this material is like the most special thing you can do. And it shouldn't be as, I wish it were, you know, there are all kinds of strategies that I think wonderful librarians and archivists like yourself are doing to get people involved and invested in their community spaces of history. You know, international histories are being told at that tiny archive in New Orleans that nobody knows about. You know, Ito Barada, who lives in Morocco, found her mom's voice in that archive. I mean, it's just like, it's like, it like makes me emotional. They're like such special places, which kind of makes me want to keep them a secret. But I'm like, no, please, like everybody go. Everybody go to your like local library, archive, special collection, make an appointment, take a friend, like instead of going to the mall, go to the archive and like hang out. They're so cool. Librarians are the fucking coolest people in the world. You guys are great. Heroes. That's what I have to say about that.
Not really a question. I don't want to like let people go like off earlier, but thank you for this amazing talk. And I think reflecting back on the name of your institution always reminds me of this this essay written by the Southern writer Toni Morrison. Like, I think it's talking about the flooding on Mississippi River as not just flooding, but memorizing its old route.
Yes.
It's just like the river has perfect memory. I forgot the exact sentence, but is that like a reference for the institution? Or?
It is actually, and in Helen Kamick's publication that we did with her, I write about the river and use that quote very specifically to talk about that like rivers are places of harboring memory, that water returns to them even when you try to keep it at bay. I mean, that's the history of New Orleans, is like the water will return it's in some way or some form. You can't sort of get rid of it, but in this way it is also, you know, very similar to archive work. Like those memories are sort of held there and they can be returned to other people when that encounter happens, you know. You can re-remember things you don't know.
I think that's such a perfect name for what your institution is doing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. That was really such an excellent talk.
Aw.
I'm really admiring of your practice, and also happy to now be one of the people who knows who Tina is.
Yes.
I didn't know before. I wanted to go back to one comment you made early on and see if you just, it's not a really coherent question, but just see if you'd be willing to speak a little bit more to it when you mentioned the kind of likelihood that her legacy and her set of practices have been less attended to, in part because of, in a way, like the breadth, the like, I don't even want to say messiness, but that art historians, in a way, there's maybe been a gravitation towards work that is simpler, more capturable, easier to maybe exert kind of control over, and that there's something about the nature of her practice that has meant that it's been a kind of gap, or been, you know, not spoken about as much until you all sort of came into the picture.
Yeah.
And so I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more to that, because just hearing you describe your work with these, you know, other people who are working with this incredibly rich, vast archive, and almost like her practice, the level, what it demands in order to tend to it,
Yeah.
and how complicated and time-consuming that is. Like, it just feels like that's such a rich model, but it also speaks to a problem within maybe not only art history, but as a contemporary art historian, I feel like I also see this kind of as a counterpoint to forms of art historical research and scholarship that, again, kind of both prioritize certain kinds of works over others, but that also a kind of maybe easier and more efficient and extractivist and controlling impulse on the part of the art historian, like that also
Yeah.
go together.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we are thinking about now is what happens after these shows are over. You know, Rivers can't hold the archive forever. We've cleaned it up, we've organized it, it's ready to go. And what if nobody wants it? It has to go back to Cecilia, to that same like non-climate controlled place. And that makes me want to cry, die, break down, run away, all kinds of things. So, you know, one of the things that I'm thinking about in the first part of your question is like, caring for this kind of thing is a life work. And institutions are not built to do life work. Our healthcare system is not shaped to do life work. Like, you know, the stress and tensions of what it means to care for a life or a lifetime of work is not something that we are excelling at right now in every way. You know, just sort of maintaining the works in the house has been financially destructive for Amy Bonwell, who is her niece and executor now. You know, she is, I mean, we'll cut this out of this talk, but like she has run out of money. She is in debt caring for this work. If the institutions don't show up to take these works and place them in their own collections with the care that they deserve, we have to think about all of that. And I think a lot about like, are we just like biding time? Is this actually a kind of violence to like care for these works beautifully for 3 years and then to let it go? You know, it's really tense. I'm 100% confident and glad that we did it. And it is the right thing to do this. I care about Tina and her legacy a lot. And yet it feels like a sort of like plug in a Band-Aid over a much bigger gaping wound that is a much bigger and broader story about the needs of estates and foundations of artists and cultural producers for the legacy and care of their work that is not present in the art world. We're really good at like raising money for a show and a presentation and a party and a public program, but like really there's this like whole underbelly of other kinds of financial needs that aren't about public presenting things that is very under-resourced. And this project has really opened my brain to that. And also made me recognize that like women and queer artists have a real uber disadvantage in this space too, because you know, the foundations get to be endowed because the artists, while they're alive, made the money to establish them. And the artists who maybe are, you know, becoming really like recognized and famous after their death, not only don't see that money in their own lifetime, but also see the neglect of their work after they're gone. And that's been really important for me as a curator to think about. Curators are very often concerned with the present, with the now, with making things for the moment. And this is a different kind of moment. This is like a different temporality of work. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. And just that thinking about that kind of cult of innovation, which is so dominant within the art world, but also within like academic art historical scholarship too, that kind of pressure, which also ties back to the question about kind of art historians sometimes dealing less with maybe more complex practices that take years to kind of like touch even or you know, attend to in a kind of meaningful, adequate way. It's like being subjected to a system where maintenance is devalued and innovation is valued.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what does it mean to do historical work? Is it to publish new scholarship or is it to like care for history? Mm-hmm. You know, like that looks not like our field.
On that note, we should care for Jordan and get you that glass of wine
Great.
and some food. Thank you very much for coming.